My name is Cornelia Woll. I am the president of the Hertie School, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you here tonight to this Hertie Futures Forum, Europe at a Turning Point, Reckoning with a New Era of Geopolitical Insecurities. Our Future Forum series marks the Hertie School's 20th anniversary and provides us with an opportunity to reflect on the past 2 decades and generate insights and policy solutions as we chart the way forward. The international security landscape has certainly seen drastic changes since the Hertie School's founding 20 years ago. In 2003, many believed that terrorism will be at the heart of violent conflict, while belligerent states, with their armies, tanks, and bombs, would somehow fade into the background. Back then, we might have been surprised to see how old-fashioned the world looks today, with an imperial war waging in the heart of Europe. Russian President Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2014, 10 years ago, annexing Crimea, which created surprisingly little international outcry at the time. With the penchant for celebrating birthdays himself, Putin continued his war against Ukraine with a full-scale invasion in February 2022, in a move that was both announced publicly and considered impossible by many observers in Germany and Europe until the very day of the attack. That tells you how important ideas are and how central it is that we continue to shape political imagination. We owe it to the people of Ukraine to stand by them and support them in their effort to defend not just their own, but the very principle of territorial integrity of nation-states. Indeed, the Russian-Ukrainian war has forever changed the European security architecture, and the avalanche of discussions around the so-called Zeitenwende has thrown Germany into a crisis of purpose. The escalation of violence in the Middle East makes it even more clear that unresolved conflicts are always catastrophes in the making. The abhorrent terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th of last year dealt a blow to Israel's sense of security and triggered a response that has plunged Gaza into death and destruction, with soaring civilian casualties and no end in sight to the humanitarian crisis. Add to these the challenges of the Indo-Pacific and the violence in the Sahel region, and it becomes clear that we urgently need to discuss what role Europe can play in this new era of insecurity, and how much it can defend its values on its own in case things turn badly after the US elections in November of this year. Our Center for International Security was launched in 2016 with the aim to establish a hub for examining the complex security challenges of the 21st century, in the heart of the German capital, with a focus on grand strategy, nuclear security, terrorism, and security in the digital age. We are proud to have made this decision in 2016, well before the German Chancellor declared Zeitenwende. And I am immensely grateful to the Center's team and its directors, from Wolfgang Ischinger, Marina Henke to Julian Wucherpfennig and Anita Gohdes, who have developed the Center's activities so well and who have gathered precious support, most recently from the Stanton Foundation, who is helping us with an endowment to raise Germany's nuclear IQ through research and education on the role of nuclear weapons in European security. Tonight, we are here to zoom out and look at the big picture, to take stock of how war is reshaping the European continent, both internally and externally. For this occasion, we are delighted to welcome 2 highly acclaimed panelists, Constanze Stelzenmüller and Timothy Garton Ash. With their unique perspectives informed by what is said about Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and their expertise, they're among the sharpest and most accomplished commentators on European and German security policy, and we've already learned a lot from both of your writing and through your public engagement. It is a true honor to have you in the room today to discuss how Europe can succeed the challenges at the turning point which we find ourselves in. Before I hand over the stage to our panel, I would like to extend a quick word of thank you. First, to all my colleagues at the Center for International Security, in particular Anita Gohdes, Tobias Bunde, Monika Seuss, as well as Stefanie Joost, Sofia Tomani, and David Baszowski. I just saw everybody, but I don't know if I'm looking in the right direction, for the excellent organization of this event. This would also not have been possible without the support of our communications team, especially Benjamin Stappenbeck, Tuha Deng, Matt Longhorn, and Sophie Morris, who continue to be kept very busy with our 20th anniversary festivities. A big thank you to all of you for making tonight possible. And without much further ado, I will hand the floor over to our moderator, Anita Gohdes, to introduce our two speakers. Anita, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout today in our forum here. My name is Anita Gohdes, and I'm Professor of International and Cybersecurity and one of the co-directors of the Center for International Security. I am absolutely delighted to have the two speakers I will now be introducing to you on stage with me. I will wait with my introduction of Constanze Stelzenmüller in a moment, but it's really fantastic to have them both here. And both of them said I shouldn't give too long introductions, but I do want to say just a few things about their wonderful credentials. Timothy Garton is Professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford. He's also Isaiah Berlin Professorial Fellow at St. Anthony's College, and he's a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He is the author of, we just talked about it, 11 books at this point, and hardly needs introduction, especially in Berlin. But I do want to highlight a few things that really demonstrate how deeply interwoven his life has been with the German and European politics. In the 1970s, he lived in both East and West Berlin, and he studied both at the Humboldt University and at the Freie University. At the time, very different universities to what they are now. But I think it demonstrates just how deeply deep his connection with Berlin is. And if I understood correctly from your writings, while you were living and studying in East Berlin, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit took a bit of an interest in your whereabouts and studies in East Berlin. So you had some encounters early on with the Stasi here as well. Timothy Garton spent his final years of the Cold War reporting on Eastern Europe and documenting the fall of communism. And he's one of the most active commentators on European affairs, from the war against Ukraine to rising populism in the EU. And I'm just going to quote our German President Steinmeier here, who called you a chronicler of the reality of Europe, which I thought was a wonderful, wonderful description, writing about its growth and development. And he also called you a passionate activist for the idea of Europe. You have just published your most personal book to date. It's titled Homelands, and it leans on experiences of working and traveling in Europe for the last 50 years. We're absolutely delighted to have you. I will wait with my introduction until the wonderful Constanze Stelzenmüller is back, but I would love to give you the floor now to give a few introductory remarks. The floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for those very kind introductions, and thank you all for coming to spend the first part of Valentine's Day evening with us. I hope the rest of your evening will be interesting in other ways. It's a great pleasure to be here to celebrate Hertie's 20th anniversary. It's a great institution, and appropriately for this Hertie school, I want to start interactively. I'm going to ask you all a question. You mustn't think too hard about it, just answer spontaneously. Is Europe at war? If you think Europe is at war, please put up your hand. Hands down. Those who think it's not at war. Put them up. Go on. Be bold, be bold, be bold. Very interesting. I would say about 2 to 1, something like that. So it's a really interesting question to ask, because obviously Europe is not at war in the sense that it was 80 years ago, in 1944. But equally obviously, it's not at peace in the way it was when the Hertie School was founded, 2003-4. If I'd asked that question then, at the founding of the Hertie School, no one would have put up their hand. So that gives you a sense of the novelty of the situation we're in, the turning point. I would argue that the 24th of February 2022, Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, was the end of what I call the post-Woll period. So famously, we have the post-war period starting in 1945, Tony Judd's great book. I argue there's a distinct period called the post-Woll period that goes from the 9th of November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, to the 24th of February 2022. If that is right, then these years are particularly important because the beginnings of periods of a new European epoch, a new European order, are particularly important, right? So think about the years after 1945. Those years, Dean Acheson said, present at the creation. They created the international order that was essentially there for the next 40 years. The years after 1989, similarly, created a new order, so that 2024 is more important than 2027 is likely to be, or 2029. Now, what I've been asked to give here is, I think, what in German is called an Impulsvortrag, a word that doesn't exist in English. So I'm going to give you 3 impulses. Ukraine, the global situation in which Europe finds itself, and Germany. First of all, Ukraine. Each of this will be very brief, telegraphic style, to kick off the conversation. I'm really looking forward to talking to my friend Constanze Stelzenmüller. So 2024 is very unlikely to be a decisive year on the battlefield in Ukraine, but what is done in 2024 is very likely to decide what will be decisive in 2025 or 2026. Whether Russia or the West is going to do more in terms of building up the defense industry, supplying arms, ammunition, training, very importantly, to the forces there, and preparing for possible offensives in 2025. And the situation is particularly dramatic for us in Europe because I would say now the likely next president of the United States is called Donald Trump, and Donald Trump has just again made it very clear that he's probably going to pull the rug from under Ukraine, if not from NATO as a whole, but more plausibly from under Ukraine. And therefore it's up to us in Europe. If we only continue at the present level of support for Ukraine, Ukraine will not be able to break through the formidable lines of defense which the Russians have built and will continue to build around their occupation of roughly 1/5 of Ukraine. That is, to bring it home to you, a territory the size of the entirety of Portugal and most of Slovenia. A territory on which millions of Ukrainians lived until recently. Now, there is a temptation in some capitals in the West, including this one, Berlin, to say, if Ukraine got the prospect of EU membership and security guarantees, possibly even NATO membership, in return for that territorial compromise, that'd be a pretty good deal for Ukraine. You can hear this said privately, whatever is said publicly, and you use the phrase territorial integrity. Let me tell you that for every single Ukrainian, that would be a massive defeat. To have lost 1/5 of your territory, for millions of Ukrainians to face the choice whether to lose their homes and go and live somewhere else in Ukraine or abroad, or to go back and live under an alien dictatorship, speaking a language they no longer wish to speak, and having their children go to school and learning an utterly falsified version of their own history. That would be a terrible defeat. And the consequence would be a politics of bitter recrimination and angry populism inside Ukraine. There are already hints of that starting, including anger against the West. For Vladimir Putin, he could declare this as a great victory. I have won back Novorossiya, The territories that Peter the Great and Catherine the Great won for Russia in the 18th century, I've won them back. Victory march. And in the eyes of the rest of the world, Russia would have won, and not just Ukraine would have lost, the West would have lost. My Oxford research project on Europe in a Changing World did some polling last autumn with ECFR, European Council on Foreign Relations, in 21 countries, 10 countries outside Europe, all the big ones, China, India, Turkey, Russia, US, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and so on. A remarkable 60, let me get the figure right, 57% of those asked in China said the US is at war with Russia. The US is at war with Russia. We may think it's between Ukraine and Russia. They think it's the US which is at war with Russia. Majorities or pluralities in South Africa, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey said the same thing. Majorities in most of those countries think that Russia will win the war within the next 5 years, 74% in China, 63% in India. And many of those same people think that the European Union is likely to fall apart in the next 20 years, 67% in China, 47% in Turkey. And there's a clear correlation between those who think Russia is likely to win and those who think the European Union is likely to fall apart. In other words, the credibility, not just of Europe, but of the West in its entirety, is at stake in the outcome of the war in Ukraine. So the alternative is, and it's the alternative I would strongly urge on our leaders, that we do much more this year, not just to increase our defense spending with the prospect of the Trump shock, but to give much larger, more certain orders to our defense industry, to supply more to Ukraine, including, by the way, the Taurus missile, Germany's Taurus missile, and crucially to give much more comprehensive training to the Ukrainian armed forces, such that they have a prospect of winning back, breaking the land bridge between Donbass and Crimea, and winning back, at the very least, the Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts, which is the key point. In other words, pushing Russia back more or less to the line of the 23rd of February 2022. I'll be happy to talk about that more in the conversation with Constanze and Anita, but that's what I want to say about Ukraine, and of course to follow up with EU enlargement. Secondly, global context. I would argue that if we think about Europe in a changing world, there are three dimensions that you have to keep in mind in every single case and the interactions between them. They are global great power competition, global challenges, and domestic political uncertainties. In those happy years when the Hertie School was founded and everything looked so good and optimistic, we had an idea, a dream, that the European Union was going to be a model of global governance for the rest of the world. Remember that? Am europäischen Wesen soll die Welt genesen. Today, it looks much more likely that the rest of the world, in fact the world in its entirety, looks not so much like late 20th century Europe, but like late 19th century Europe writ large. In other words, it is a world of great and middle powers fiercely pursuing their own national interests and competing in all dimensions. And by the way, Narendra Modi and Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Xi Jinping, and not to mention Vladimir Putin, have no hesitation saying in terms that that's what they're about, pursuing their national interests. Again, in this piece of polling that we did with ECFR, my co-authors Mark Leonard and Ivan Krastev and I wrote about an a la carte world. Because one of the things we found was that these great and middle powers are coolly transactional. Not for them the bipolar choice, the West or the rest, the North or the South. From issue to issue, they are perfectly happy to align with any other great powers on the kind of global board of diplomacy. For India, for example, thinks it has good relations with the US, with the UK, with the EU, and with Russia. perfectly happy having good relations with Russia. That is the world we are in. And we in Europe, with our strongly values-based rhetoric, have to think again about how we address these other great powers. That's complicated by the fact of the global challenges, which many of you spend a lot of time thinking about. I don't need to remind you that at the end of last month, January, for the first time ever, we had a 12-month period in which global average temperatures exceeded 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So the target of controlling climate change has already been exceeded. Now, I know there were El Nino and annual variations and so on, but this is a shocking fact. And surface temperatures were, of course, at unprecedented heights. World population has exceeded 8 billion. If you add global inequality, that leads to major migratory pressures, and, of course, the challenges of AI, to mention just a few. And then domestic political uncertainties, especially fragmentation and polarization. And the point is that each of these three dimensions interact on any given issue. So there's another bit of very interesting polling just come out by the EU Opinions project of the Bertelsmann Stiftung, which illustrates this very clearly. It's called The War and the Vote. I commend it to you. And it breaks things down not just by countries, but also by political parties. And what you find is a really interesting distribution, which is a classic kind of that line, a kind of mound line, in which, for example, both on EU enlargement to include Ukraine and on weapons supplies to Ukraine, you have support in the center. And by the way, in Germany, the center seems to be the Greens now, interestingly enough. And then much less support at both extremes, right? So both AfD and Bundesrat-Wagenknecht on both these issues, much, much less support. So in each case, you have to factor in that domestic political landscape of fragmentation and polarization. That brings me to my final impulse about Germany, which I'm sure we'll spend plenty of time talking about. I don't need to remind you, this year sees two anniversaries: 75th anniversary of the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany, 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Not surprisingly, since this is the place where the wall came down, Germany was the quintessential post-wall country. All the illusions of the post-wall period were found in spades in Germany. The illusion, the end of history illusion, the illusion that basically we had worked it out, we'd found a model, and it's a sort of vulgar version of modernization theory, and that sooner or later countries like Russia or China would come along and approach us. To put it another way, it's that we confused history with a small h and history with a large H. I'm afraid you can't do that in German, because all nouns have capital letters, which may be partly why the confusion was so strong in Germany. That is to say, the confusion between history as it really happens, which is always the interaction between deep structure and process on the one hand, and conjuncture, chance, contingency, collective will, and individual leadership on the other. That's how history always happens. That's how 1989 happened. But with time, we came to confuse it with history with a capital H, an inevitable process of the progress towards the widening of freedom, a Hegelian process, what Francis Fukuyama was talking about in his End of History essay. All the illusions that were particular to Germany, Constanze Stelzenmüller formulated this brilliantly. We outsourced our security to the United States, our energy requirements to Russia, and our economic growth to China. gone, going, gone, or going, gone, going. All of them now tumbling. The illusion, I would say, that Germany, having learned the lessons from its past, could continue both to do well and to do good, right? In other words, you could have all the economic benefits of all these different relationships, but still uphold certain standards and believe that you were doing good. That, in my view, came crashing down in Ukraine. And for me, a crucial moment, I have to say quite personally, was the moment very soon after the full-scale invasion, March 2022, when many of us, and this was a German-led initiative, appealed for an absolute stop to Russian oil and gas supplies to Germany. I think Constanze also signed the appeal. Anyway, the argument was made also on grounds of history, that Germany, above all, had said nie wieder, never again. And here it was, the big war in Europe was happening again. And if ever there was an occasion to take a radical step, and Germany didn't take that step. It did, and I have to pay tribute to Robert Habeck, wean itself off gas and oil as fast as possible. But in the meantime, tens of billions of euros were paid into Russia's war chest. The argument was German industry would collapse, it would be an economic catastrophe for the whole of Europe. Many economists actually argued this wouldn't necessarily be the case. It would be a shock significantly smaller than that experienced by several South European economies during the Eurozone crisis. They estimate about 3% on GDP. Arguable, we can never know. But for me, that was a moment where the tension between doing well and doing good was painfully apparent. In Israel now, with the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, you have a similar tension. Post-war Germany, post-war West Germany, took both an exceptionalist position and a universalist position. The exceptionalist position was that Germany had a unique responsibility towards Israel because of the Holocaust. The universalist position was that Germany had a unique responsibility to stand up for human rights, international rule of law, to ensure, for example, that there was not disproportionate killing of civilians violating international law and the rules of war. In Gaza, these two things clash. And I think maybe, again, we'd like to talk about that in the conversation. Now, for me, the good news is that there is a vigorous debate about this in Germany, and that every point I might want to make myself has been made by German academics, German intellectuals, German journalists, German think tankers, even German politicians. The bad news is that the policy still feels like an expression of the debate, right? In other words, there is no clear strategic direction to the policy. It reflects, so to speak, the internal confusion and disorientation. And so for example, I pay tribute. Germany has massively increased its funding for arms and ammunition for Ukraine. 8 billion this year. Fantastic. But to do what? What is the goal of German government policy with this 8 billion euros? Do you actually want to help Ukraine to win? Or do you simply want to help it not to lose? Well, I spelled out at the beginning what, quote unquote, not to lose would mean. You give 8 billion euros, but you're not going to send the Taurus? Where's the logic or consistency in that? And absent such clear strategic direction, which in the Federal Republic has to come from the Chancellery, public opinion is also disoriented. So in this latest EU opinions polling, although the German government has a clear position of supporting EU enlargement to Ukraine, there's a very worrying result, which is, in this poll, there was a narrow majority in Germany against EU enlargement to Ukraine, 52% to 48%, whereas in France, wait for it, France, 57% for, 43% against. What world is this we're in, where France is much more enthusiastic about the eastward enlargement of the EU than Germany? Well, we'll come to that, but it helps to have a clear leadership from on top. Okay, my very final point, and then I'm looking forward very much to the conversation. This afternoon, if any of you have not seen the exhibition Paths Not Taken at the German Historical Museum, I strongly recommend it to you. And at all these key moments in history, there are always alternatives. History is never alternativlos, to use a favorite word of a former German chancellor. And in the history of the Federal Republic, in those 75 years, there have been 3 key strategic geopolitical choices. And at each moment, there were many options available. There were many paths not taken. They were, of course, Konrad Adenauer's Westbindung, the integration of the Federal Republic into the Cold War West, Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, the Eastern policy, and Helmut Kohl's strategic decision to put together German and European unification as 2 sides of the same coin. These were 3 great moments of strategic choice and leadership in which Germany, in each case very positively, shaped European history. And I believe the moment has come when we need a 4th such moment, and that depends on the people upstairs, in the Chancellery and elsewhere, but it also depends on you, ladies and gentlemen, demanding it from below. And with that, I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that absolutely wonderful Impulsvortrag, as we like to say in German. And I really look forward to the discussion right now. I will briefly introduce Constanze Stelzenmüller, who we are also absolutely delighted to have here. She also needs little introduction in the heart of Berlin. She's currently director of the Center on the United States and Europe and the inaugural holder of the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at Brookings. And before she became a highly sought-after policy expert, she was an editor at Die Zeit in a very tumultuous period, as was also just referred to, from the mid-90s to mid-2000s, where she covered everything from genocide to humanitarian crises and war crimes tribunals. She's a frequent commentator on politics as well. She has a monthly column in the Financial Times. And I'll say, especially for the Hertie community, on a more personal note, that we're delighted to have her here again because she gave a highly memorable commencement speech here for our EMPA graduates. And she's also appeared as a guest on our Berlin Security Beat podcast. And it's a wonderful episode. I recommend it if you'd like to hear more about Constanze's personal career and how she got into working on security and defense. So another round of applause for our second guest of the night. Timothy, you had so many really important pieces of, I'll just use the German word impulses here for us, that I think that there's a lot that we want to cover tonight. But I'd like to start at the European level, because I think, we're talking about this from a school in the heart of Europe, and you mentioned many of these discussions and decisions need to be made at the European level as well. And I want to look towards the European elections that are coming up now. Of course, in June, the elections of the European Parliament. Within the EU itself, we have many radical right-wing parties and populist parties gaining prominence. Now, recently, we had some protests in Germany, people taking to the streets. You also wrote about this, standing up against radical right and populist parties. But overall, we're seeing that there's a great interest in what populists and especially right-wing leaders have to say within Europe. How do you think, and I pose this question to both of you, and maybe we'll start with Constanze on this. How do you think European security is going to be affected by this, and how can it actually remain operational if we see majorities switching even further within the European Union?
Well, first off, thank you for having me. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you for having me here. I apologize for that coughing fit at the beginning. Hoping you would introduce me meanwhile, but no. And honestly, without joking, thank you for the very kind and generous introduction. It's always lovely to be here, and it's always lovely to be in discussion with Timothy, whom I've known for longer than I think I care to admit. And yes, you and I, at this point, I think can look back on, shall we just say, several decades of experience with this topic. And I share your assessment of both the gloom and the urgency of the moment. And not least because of what you've just raised, which is the surge across the West of populist movements. And they're not just populist, aren't they? They are hard right extremists. And they are hard right extremists, white nationalists in most cases, almost all cases. And they are bent on constitutional regime change, right? This isn't just, sort of louts with baseball bats, sort of parading in the marketplaces of small Saxon towns. These people are much more organized. They have media, they have think tanks, they have politicians and policymakers, and they have ideas about how Western constitutional spaces ought to be ordered, which are distinctly different. Perhaps not from certain historical models, but certainly distinctly different from the liberal representative democratic model that we have come to cherish and perhaps to take for granted. And so I think the point of constitutional regime change is I think what I most want to harp on, right? That is where it becomes a question, where it's no longer just about freedom of speech, but about preserving the republic, as it were. The German expression many of you will know is Wehrhafte Demokratie, about democracy defending itself against domestic aggressors who want to upend it. And, I do find it really quite shocking that we even have to talk about this, particularly in a country with this history, and that living for the third time in my life in America, with a history of more than 200 years of democracy, and in many ways the inventor of Western representative democracy in large, complex societies, that we should be encountering this temptation, this authoritarian temptations in the countries where we thought democracy, for a variety of reasons, was most deeply rooted.
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is in a way more dangerous than Brexit. You remember everybody was talking about Frexit and Nexit and Hungexit and all of that. These guys are not going to be as stupid as the Brits. We've shown you how stupid that is, right? They're not going to leave. They're going to try to change it from inside. Number two, the key figure here to look at is Viktor Orban, because Viktor Orban has succeeded in demolishing democracy in Hungary while it is a full member state of the European Union. If you ask your political scientist professor here at the Hertie School, I think most of them will tell you Hungary is no longer a democracy, not just a liberal democracy, they would describe it as a competitive authoritarian regime. In other words, the threat is that the project of the European Union becomes detached from the regime type of liberal democracy and can live with other regime types. And that is Orban's project. So when we come to the European elections, Orban's hope is, and by the way, I keep quoting ECFR studies, but the ECFR polling on this is also very interesting because it suggests that the hard right populist vote may be larger than many people are currently anticipating, and that while the EPP would remain the main group, I mean the biggest group in the European Parliament, there is a chance, a danger, that Orban could succeed in his project, which is to put together the two hard right groups, the ECR and the ID group, and make it potentially larger than the liberal group in the European Parliament. So it would have a very significant blocking power. So I think that's a real danger. I mean, one of the stumbling blocks is that not all those hard right parties agree about Putin. They're not all pro-Putin. So Giorgia Meloni, for example, is actually a strong supporter of Ukraine. Last comment, the way to fight it, the center-right, and I would including this, in some respects, CDU, CSU in this country, is doing it precisely the wrong way round. What the center-right is trying to do, and actually Macron is trying to do this a bit, is to steal the populist clothes by adopting part of their rhetoric, right, while not actually having effective policies to control migration, for example. What you need to do is the precise opposite. You need to have effective policies, for example, to manage migration, to meet people's concerns, but utterly reject and combat the xenophobic nationalist rhetoric. So that, I think, is the challenge for the centre-right and to some extent centre-left parties in the run-up to the European elections, is to switch it round, combat the rhetoric, but have an effective policy.
Thank you. Another issue that you raised in your Impulsvortrag, and that I think also has played quite heavily into a lot of the rhetoric and the discussions we've seen in Germany, but also in other European countries, is responses to Ukraine when compared to responses to the current violence in the Middle East. And so you mentioned this, and I thought it was very interesting, of course, especially now, kind of looking back 2 years after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and that being at the core of Europe's strategic questions and geopolitical positioning. And then at the kind of second or third point, were you talking about Europe's response, Germany's response to what's happening within the Middle East. And so my second question to both of you is, how do you think these differing responses will, in the long term, affect Europe's geopolitical position? And the reason why I'm so excited to ask this question to the two of you is because you're not just extremely knowledgeable and long-term analysts of what's happening in Germany, but you've spent a lot of time here, but now you're also looking kind of from the outside in, and it would be really interesting for us here in Berlin to hear your perspective on these current policy discussions, as you said, very forcefully being had, but not necessarily being translated into action. Don't know who'd like to start.
Okay. So it's a great question. There's a lot to be said about it, but a couple of comments. Tell me your double standards and I'll tell you who you are. Right? I mean, everyone has them. And in my work on free speech, that was my rule of thumb. Liberals have them too. But our double standards on this, particularly in the eyes of the rest of the world, are looking quite extreme. And my view would be, if the exceptionalist imperative and the universalist imperative conflict, I would hope that in the country of Immanuel Kant, the universalist imperative would prevail. I think we have to be consistent. If we believe in international law, we have to defend international law. And when the world's highest court, the UNICJ, however problematic the judgment, says there are genocidal elements here, we have to sit up and listen. We can't just brush that aside and pretend it didn't happen. So that's point number one. We have to try and examine and try and avoid the double standards and stick to what for me is the most fundamental message from the 20th century, which is to uphold these standards of international law and human rights and human dignity consistently. The other point is the crossover to Ukraine. And this has several aspects. As I indicated, describing to you that polling we did with ECFR, we were getting almost nowhere in making the argument to Indians or Turks or South Africans or Brazilians that what Putin is doing in Ukraine is a colonial war, which it is. It's a war of recolonization. We were getting almost nowhere with that argument. We were just beginning to start to get somewhere with this argument, an argument based on international law. And then the Israel-Hamas war explodes, and the rest of the world turns around and says, who do you think you're kidding? Your double standards are so apparent. And then, of course, Israel, Hamas, competes both for US diplomatic attention and time and money and weapons supplies to some extent, so that it's a huge problem for the position I was arguing for over Ukraine, both in the substance of our policy, but also in the perception of the rest of the world.
Right. Sorry. That's a lot to digest. Where do I begin? I'm a universalist myself, I think, not least because I trained as a human rights lawyer and wrote a lot about, as you mentioned, about the first international war crimes tribunals and the creation of the International Criminal Court, which I reported on for Side back in the day. So I tend to think that I'm a universalist, but I also want to be extremely precise in the application of legal criteria. And I don't think this is the place or the time to go into the ICJ ruling or the definition of genocide, except to say that it needs to be used with extreme caution and very sparingly. And so, and again, I don't think this is the time and the place for this. But we have to the Ukraine war is that rarest of wars that is, with complete truth, a war of aggression. And where, even although it is quite possible that individual Ukrainian units might have committed war crimes at some point, or committed excesses in their legitimate self-defense, the aggressor is clearly and solely on one side, right? That is the absolute exception in international law, right? It is the very rare case where that is true. The Israel-Hamas war is sadly much more complicated, although I do want to say that the attacks of October 7th will go down in the history of infamy, right, as just an extraordinary crime, right? One where I think it would behoove all of us to not forget to have the proper empathy. I'll leave it there. I'm not suggesting you don't have. You're not saying that. All I'm saying is let's leave that aside for the moment and say the following, which I think will get us onto a slightly more productive terrain for this evening. I just thought I had sort of walking here. One of the things that Brookings runs and that I'm in charge of organizing every year is the Brio Lecture on International Law. And it's the 10th iteration this year. We have had, for the obvious reasons, asked in the past 2 years, Philippe Sands and Una Hathaway to talk about war crimes and international criminal law. And this year we're asking Matthias Spector, a Brazilian international grand strategist, to speak about the US, the West, and international law in a context of strategic grand competition. And here's the thought that I had walking here, and I'd just like to sort of lob it at you and see how you respond. Because you were drawing so beautifully the arc of history from the fall of the wall to the present day. And it seems to me that once again, as is in fact so often the case, the US and the Germans find themselves in a very parallel situation, which is that both of us are at the same time losing hegemony in a world of grand competition. The Americans are losing their strategic hegemony as a superpower in a world where superpowerdom, because of economic interdependence, arguably matters less, and are losing, for a variety of reasons, moral authority as well, not least because of how the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War ended up. We Germans, and you described this, and I am in violent agreement with you about your description of the hubris and the overreading by the Germans of the moment of 1989-90. We Germans were full of the feeling that we were now a moral superpower, right? And I think that this moment, and I think especially this year, shows us just how great the limitations on that role in Europe are. Let me remind you that 10 years ago in Munich, 3 German senior politicians, the president, the foreign minister, and the defense minister, went on stage and said in parallel, using parallel phrasing, that Germany was an economic superpower in Europe and therefore needed to take on more responsibility, to lean into its power and its responsibility. I have been hoping, and I'm still praying, that something similar might occur this weekend in Munich, not least because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, the comments from Trump, the remarks, the threats by Putin in the Carlson interview against Poland and the Baltics. And I'm praying even more that somebody might be organizing a European version of this, right? That would be the moment. If there were a place and a moment, it would be this weekend and in Munich. Do I think it's going to happen, given what I'm seeing? No, what I'm seeing is, as you say, a vacuum of strategy and of vision at the European level and at the German level. And I think that we are largely to be held responsible for both those things.
I'm going to have to say a couple more words about Gaza because we've sort of put it in the room. So let me, as quickly as possible, say those few words and then come back to what you just said. Of course, I am not endorsing the word genocide in this context. All I am saying is that if the ICJ issues such a ruling, it's something you need to engage with. The word that has to be avoided at all costs here is the word but, right? So if you say yes, but, what comes after the but always has more weight than what comes before. So if you say 7th October was terrible, but... Exactly. What you have to do, however, and Barack Obama did this brilliantly, is to make a series of statements, each of which are true. It is true that the origin of this problem is European barbarism. That's the reason there's the State of Israel. It is true that the attacks on the 7th of October were absolutely barbaric and horrific and triggered an absolute and understandable national trauma. It is true that Hamas has been hiding under various facilities and has been spending a lot of money building tunnels instead of looking after the health and welfare of their own people. It is also true that the civilian casualties have been disproportionate by any reasonable reading of the laws of war and of international humanitarian law. That is also true. It doesn't make any of the other things any less true, but that is also true. 13,000 children and counting. They weren't Hamas terrorists. And I would just wish that, particularly in Germany, it would be possible to have a free and open debate about all these truths and about what follows from the last of them. There's so much to gather. By the way, you'll notice that Constanze and I almost entirely agree on almost everything. So we will seek disagreements for the sake of this evening. But
we'll take note for the next
this one,
time.
I can't disagree because for me, the fundamental point is your final point. It's a European context. No one is asking Germany to be a superpower. No one is asking Germany to have a national strategy for the world. We are asking Germany to be primus inter pares, to be part of a strategic coalition of the willing, which, by the way, is back on offer because in one of the only good news stories of the last year, in an unfair election, Poland, as we say in England, kicked the bastards out. Pardon my French. In other words, it reversed a quite far advanced populist state capture. And therefore, just in the last few days, we've seen the Weimar Triangle being reactivated. In addition to which, you have this extraordinary turn in French policy. A friend of mine says that the British have the royal family, but France actually has the monarchy. And there's a lot of truth in that. And the advantage of having a monarchy, a republican monarchy, is when the monarch changes his mind, the whole state turns. And the monarch has changed his mind on enlargement, both of EU and NATO. And there's an amazing shift in the French position. Now, what that creates is a constellation in which there's really a perfect moment for Germany to engage with the Weimar Triangle and try to craft a real European strategy, what I call a Gesamteuropapolitik. But it needs that strategic thinking.
Instead of which, I believe, we are going around saying that other people should do more.
Yes, that is unfortunate.
Indeed.
Let me just follow up on this. I think this was a really important point, and I really like the way that you described the downfall of the German moral superpower. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Again, I'm so happy to have you two here on stage to talk about this. And in your presentation, you mentioned this point of the lack of strategic culture in Germany, right? This is something we've talked about a lot at the Hertie School as well, and we really try to discuss this with our students, thinking about strategy, not just about policy tools individually, but strategy at whole. So having you two here on stage help us understand how Germany can move forward on this. What are concrete things that could be done to improve the strategic culture? You mentioned, the ideal scenario would be to have some kind of event now in the context of the Munich Security Conference, but if that doesn't happen,
that's political signaling.
Yes.
But let me. I would actually just like to make a brief pitch in defense of what the Germans have had to go through in the past 2 years, and this government. Let's not forget that in December 21, this government came on the heels of 16 years of Merkelian incrementalism, and of which I think it is not unfair to say that by the end of which all of us felt it was time for a change. And so I was, I think, one of the many who viewed this unusual constellation with a great deal of sympathy, appreciated genuinely the fact that they came with plans to not just, sort of massage non-change incrementally, but to actually effectuate transformational, social, economic, and climate policies. I thought, good on you for even wanting to do that and saying that you want to do it and writing it in your coalition program. Brilliant. That is, I'll be sharing you, right? And I would also give them genuine credit, because the one thing that they hadn't planned for, the one thing that they thought they didn't need to transform was going to be foreign and security policy, right? That was going to stay safely, chuntering along in the usual solid way, right? Those developments were strictly unplanned. And I think that for a sort of new generational group of people who had just started to learn how to work with each other, I feel that they responded very forcefully, right? Very energetically, and in the case of decoupling from Russian energy, with warp speed, genuine warp speed, to the challenge of cutting off the Russians. I would also say that even in defense, where, having studied this, alas, for quite a long time and far too much detail when I was at die Zeit, I know from personal experience the arrayed forces of inertia built into the system to drive any German defense minister to despair. And it seems to me that this defense minister knows what he's doing, knows what he wants to do, is deploying a great deal of energy, and crucially, is not being sabotaged by the Chancellor. Because that is the ultimate enemy of any German defense minister, right, is the Chancellor, because the Chancellor always looks at the defense minister as replacement Chancellor. So that's, all of that I give people credit for. What I find, again, which is, I return to my earlier point, what I find rather more underwhelming is it seems to me, distinct lack of ambition in defining a strategy for the future of Ukraine, defining a vision for the future of a Europe that, for the foreseeable future, as long as Russia remains totalitarian domestically and imperial externally, has to defend itself against Russia, and where Germany, whether it wants to or not, will have to play a leading role, right? There I find our imagination, our policies singularly lacking. And I find that not just disappointing, but frankly, slightly terrifying.
How many cheers do you think there was? 2 cheers for Germany? 2.5? I certainly wasn't the full
none
3.
was my point.
3 cheers. Anyway, so I share your 2 cheers, and I also very much share the view that what they inherited from the Merkel years was, to use the English phrase, it was a poisoned chalice. And I'm very interested to read Angela Merkel's memoirs. Someone has proposed in jest the title My Excuses, which I think is not the title she's going to use, but I mean, from Eurozone to nuclear power to 2014 to dependency on China to Hungary, actually, or Viktor Orban. I mean, there's a whole series of issues where we want to hear the argument. To put it mildly, but on your what's missing, Constanze. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about this at the moment. I mean, two points. The Federal Republic is a very peculiar political system because it's a parliamentary system where the Chancellor has extraordinarily personal authority, more like an American president or a French president in some respect. Arnold Baring's book about the beginnings of the Federal Republic, the first sentence is Im Anfang war Adenauer. And that there's a real truth in that, so that if the Chancellor...
Especially from Adenauer's point of view.
Yeah, but he made it. Im Anfang war Adenauer, it's true. And therefore, if the Chancellor, and in the 3 great moments that I described, the Westbindung, Ostpolitik, and Kohl in the German unification, it was a strategic leadership given by the Chancellor who also explained it to the German people, to German society. So I'll give a lot of credit, but I think that is frankly lacking. The other point is that what you have in Germany is what the historian James Sheehan has described as the Primat der Wirtschaftspolitik, the primacy of economic policy. I mean, that is very much, particularly in the history of the Federal Republic after German unification. Calvin Coolidge is said to have said, the business of America is business. Well, I'm often inclined to say the business of Germany is business, right? So if you look at it, the priority always given not just to the economy, but specifically to the interests of business, including the access and influence that business has very directly on German policymaking and German politics. Also, by the way, because of Mitbestimmung, so that if they don't get it from the bosses, they get it from the trade unions, who have a shared interest in the particular, more trade with China, for example, and then they can argue about dividing the cake. So that I think there's a kind of structural issue about shifting from the Primat der Wirtschaftspolitik, the business of Germany is business, to a more geopolitical and strategic thinking.
I know that we have an extremely attentive audience who is probably dying to ask you lots of questions as well. So I will end with one more quick question, and that is, you are both headed to Munich tomorrow, to the Munich Security Conference. You're longtime friends, attendees, participants of being involved in the Munich Security Conference, and we heard our own Tobias Bunde, of course, is involved heavily there as well. We heard that there's likely to be a side meeting of the G7 foreign ministers there again, as it is in many years. And I've also heard from many personal stories from attendees at the Munich Security Conference that it's a very intimate surrounding, and you might get stuck on the elevator with, some very famous people. So here's my question.
Define intimate. Can I just say,
Anita, it's a complete madhouse.
I'm talking about
with just our 2,000 closest prime ministers.
Exactly. When I speak of intimate, I mean dense in terms of the population. Just to clarify that. So should you be stuck on an elevator by chance with the G7 foreign ministers and have a couple of moments to give them your best advice on the current security situation, what would you tell them?
I genuinely wouldn't presume. Really. I think that would be untoward. I will say, though, since a lot of you here are students, the way I got to become a participant of the Munich Security Conference, and I want to encourage you to be forward-leaning in these things, was that I used to be invited as a journalist, then I joined the German Marshall Fund and was no longer invited. And since I had just met the then National Security Advisor, Telchik, I wrote him an email. And the email said in the header, Munich Security Conference, this was 2007, and the body of the email said, which fence would I have to chain myself to? Yours truly, Constanze Stelzenmüller, mit herzlichen Grüßen. And he, to my great surprise, very kindly sent me a full participants invitation, upon which I wrote back, thanked him, and said, you don't have a lot of women at this conference, and here are the names of 6 more. If you think you can invite me, you can also invite these. Anyway. So always think of the ones who come after you.
How can I possibly compete with that? By the way, some of the great heroes of Munich are, in fact, women. For example, Kaja Kallas of Estonia, who has just been put unbelievably on the wanted list by Russia. I myself, by the way, yesterday learned that I'm now sanctioned by Russia, which I take as a great honor and compliment.
I think I'm the only person on the planet not sanctioned. Very sad.
But if I had the G7 leaders in the lift, which I won't,
foreign ministers,
whoever, I would have a go at them. My elevator pitch would be: decide what your objective is in Ukraine, and your objective in Ukraine should be that Ukraine should win, and then do what it takes to make that happen. Because that is the one immediate step on which so much else is going to depend. I mean, you can go on and on about, 2%, not 2%, this or that, long-term things. But this is something where decisions have to be taken right now, and it will have such enormous consequences. And they'd probably flee the elevator from me.
Well, I'm going to watch for you skulking around the elevators in the lobby.
I won't be waiting, Constanze, I can tell you.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I will now open up for questions and answers, and I'll take questions in batches. I know that there are a lot. Please do introduce yourself when you ask your question. I'll start over here with the gentleman in the beige. Yes. No.
Hello?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm doing a Master's of Public Policy here. And I wanted to ask you, you talked about this fourth moment that is needed, the fourth grand moment. And you also talked about the view that other countries have if the Ukraine loses this war. Besides the terrible consequences for the Ukrainian people, if they do lose this war, what do you think the consequences will be for the world order as we see it, and for the position and reputation, I guess, of Europe within it?
Thank you. I saw a hand up somewhere over here. Yes, the gentleman at the back in the black shirt. There's a microphone coming.
Johannes Ahlefeld, political advisor to the German Social Democrats in Parliament. First, a short reply to Timothy's question. I'm not sure whether many people noticed that the Chancellor in the budget speech 2 weeks ago said with a view to Ukraine aid, that there may be a situation that others can't deliver on pledges that were made last year. And that despite all the difficulties in the budget, Germany would be looking favorably at an arrangement of upping the ante with other partners in the EU to make true on what we promised. What I got with a view to our complicating scenery is, let's say, somewhat more alarming. The populism is not only right-wing, we also got left-wing. We got Sarah Wagenknecht over here. We got Fico in Slovakia, a social Democrat partner in the past, at least. And we got the Spanish and Greek populists as well. What do you make of this? It's not as easy as, let's say, we march against the right. It's more complicated, and I think it's more difficult to decipher it in terms of defending, let's say, the Republic. Against whom exactly, and against which policies? And we should be looking more closely to our partners. For example, with a view to the fusion that Timothy was talking about. I think we're not really aligning enough the forces across Europe. The Czechs recently, the right-wingers, opposed Orban joining ECR, which would be the first step for the fusion that he's planning. So let's say, how are we going to do this, in a sense? We got to join forces. How?
Thank you. And we have one third question. I also encourage the women participants of tonight to raise their hands and ask questions. I'll take one more over here. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this amazing discussion so far. I'm Linda. I'm also a student here at the Hertie School. I'm studying an MIA with a focus on security. And Anita has been my professor in the first year. I have a question. So, Constanze, you talked about the lack of ambition in Germany to defend itself against Russia and, also the war in Ukraine. I noticed a similar lack of ambition when it comes to strategy regarding the Trump election, the possible Trump election that's coming up. And I was wondering, would you agree that Germany has not yet kind of prepared itself for and also acknowledged that Trump might win in the next period, in the next election? And also, do you think that the reaction might turn out similar to the last time when he was elected? So basically, very little prepared. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll do another round in a moment. Timothy, Constanze, who would like to take a go at the questions first?
The first question was a really big one. That's yours.
The consequences of a Ukrainian defeat in terms of the perception of the rest of the world would be that it would strongly reinforce the credibility of Putin's narrative that the West is weak and decadent. And it would therefore very much encourage more transactionalism between these other great and middle powers, more turning to each other rather than believing in and turning back to the West. And specifically, I've absolutely no doubt, it would encourage Xi Jinping to think that he might have a chance of getting back Taiwan by blackmail or by force. If Putin got away with seizing a territory the size of larger than Portugal, right next door to the EU and NATO, what's to stop China seizing a small island just off its coast? And that goes to, if I may connect it to the last question about the Trump shock, which I'd love to hear from Constanze on, because she sits in Washington watching it very closely. But unlike Trump 1, first-term Trump, Trump 2.0 has a bunch of think tanks quite carefully, systematically planning for what he's going to do, the Heritage Foundation. And one of their key ideas is, we've got to concentrate on China. There's a man called Elbridge Colby, who's very influential in these circles, and he says clearly, we have to pull our forces out of Europe because we need to concentrate on China. And so one of the arguments we have to make, apart from the fact we Europeans are doing much more for our own defense, which we need to do, Trump had a point, whisper it not, is actually, if you want to deter Xi Jinping from going after Taiwan, you've got to help Ukraine to win. It's the other way around. Very quickly on the question from the back from the SPD advisor, The Polish populists, peace, law and justice, had a really interesting phrase. They talked about the redistribution of respect, right? Not of money, respect. We are giving you people in the countries and the small countryside and the small towns who feel ignored and disrespected, we're giving you respect. And it's a really important point. So that if we're trying to win the voters back from the populists, and actually Scholz had this, people forget, in his election campaign, this agenda of the redistribution of respect, saying we hear you, we hear your concerns, we respect your maybe not metropolitan values, we want to do something for you, seems to me absolutely key. So no respect for the populist leaders, but a lot of respect for their voters.
On the question of respect, I'm going to veer off briefly into movie history. Yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the first showing of Blazing Saddles, one of the great genius works of cinematography by one Mel Brooks. And it's an anti-racist movie that Mel Brooks made together with Richard Pryor. It has many, many, many glorious moments. But there is a particularly glorious moment that I tweeted yesterday, in case you need a shortcut, where Gene Wilder explains to Cleavon Little, who is the black sheriff of a town in the Wild West set up for failure, of course, explains what the salt of the earth really are. It's hysterical. It's clearly an unscripted moment, and the black sheriff, who's trying to look firm and tragic and so on, explodes into giggles. And it is really the warm-hearted heart of this, in many ways, quite serious movie, and I recommend you see it, which is a very oblique way of saying respect is good, but sometimes you just have to laugh at people when they're saying really stupid things. Okay? And frankly, people who vote for fascists, right, in this day and age, don't really, frankly, they don't get no respect from me. Forgive me. All right, so much for that. On the left, yeah, I have to say, I find this whole BSW setup deeply, deeply off-putting and distasteful, right? But I note with interest and some concern just how disciplined that Party Foundation meeting was. Now, that is not to say that Sarah Wagenknecht and her group are capable of actually organizing a party or organizing a political campaign. That I have yet to see. In the same way that while I take very, very seriously what you've just described, right, the whole sort of, organizational consolidation of the American ultra-right, right? And the way that it has shifted the Overton window, it's shifted the discourse, legitimized, right, certain things. The way it has put traditional internationalist, neocons, social conservative Republicans on the defensive. I would also say that we are actually seeing the old geezers putting up a surprising amount of fight, right? I, last week, thought that was the end of Ukraine and Israel aid. And I have to confess that I am impressed that the Senate and McConnell had it in them at their advanced age to get through a 70-29 resolution and plonk it in front of the House. Good on them, right? I didn't expect that. In fact, I sort of, in several meetings that I'm going to have to apologize for, predicted the opposite. So, good on them. That's, still the likelihood of failure in the House is very great, but I think there's some life in the old beast yet. And I don't think, and I want to sort of tell everybody here, I don't think that the US election is a foregone conclusion. I think what's clear is that Trump has a stranglehold on the GOP, right? But the GOP is suddenly finding sort of, manly virtues in itself that it didn't know it still had. And I actually think that this will be a massively mobilizing moment for American civil society, and that we're going to see a lot of fighting. Hopefully not real fighting, right? So, wait and see. And if if there is another Trump administration, have at it. again, the German lack of ambition vis-a-vis the US election, but I've been watching this for a while now. I remember the first time Scholz came to Washington. I believe it was February 7, 22. 2.5 weeks before the invasion, and calmly smiling while President Biden sort of celebrated a love fest, right, of US and German political renewal, right? It was Valentine's Day 1 week early, right? Except that Olaf Scholz was not in the mood for love. It was frankly a little bit embarrassing, particularly since Biden had just prevented, with a sort of his executive presidential fiat, right, POTUS spoke, a bipartisan attempt in Congress to sanction the Germans for Nord Stream 2. Right? I recently found an email from a quite senior German diplomat from 2019, after I'd written a nasty column in the FT about Nord Stream 2, saying, I thought we might regret this one day, saying that I was entirely wrong. I was far too critical of German policy in general, and this one in particular. And there was some political risk involved, but it was all controllable. Famous last words, right? So I do think that the Germans in general have tended to sort of skate on the assumption that whatever love they get in Washington is due to them as a matter of course, because we are the good guys. And I happen to know from sort of comments of American officials that there are American officials who find this personally mildly grating, right? And I think that we could be a little more imaginative, a little more generous. I am not going to talk about tanks. I agree with you on the Taurus. But the problem, as you say, is not the individual weapon system. It is the willingness to say, we'll do this. I mean, what we really ought to be doing now, right, is massive burden shifting to do two things. Validate the extraordinary amount of trust, the bet that Biden placed on us, and at the same time, take the steam out of the Trumpists.
Can I just add one word on that? We want some more questions here. By the way, it would help, to be more optimistic about the U.S. election if Joe Biden could remember the difference between the president of Egypt and Mexico at a point when he's trying to tell us his memory is so good. I mean this quite seriously. The fact that Biden looks so old and frail is a huge problem. It's not a foregone conclusion, but it is a huge problem. But be it Biden or Trump, the larger point is that future U.S. administrations are going to be less Atlanticist, not more. That's a structural feature of U.S. politics, of U.S. culture, of U.S. society, of U.S. history. So, it makes a big difference to Biden or Trump, but we under no illusions, we're never going to get a more Atlanticist U.S. administration. You're only going to get a less one. And actually, Obama, interestingly enough, was although we all voted for him, was actually in no way so Atlanticist as Clinton had been or Biden is. So there is a structural trend there. Whoever wins the next US election, which means we Europeans have to get our act together and do more for ourselves.
Do we have more questions? I see 2 hands over here. 3 hands. Okay, wonderful. Please do introduce yourself, and please do keep your questions relatively short so we can get in as many as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Koplovich. I'm a political science professor at the University of Wisconsin and a fellow here at the American Academy this spring. So on this last point of Europe doing more, I know we're talking about security, but as the good political economist in the room, both German and European economic policy with the Stability and Growth Pact and the Schuldenbremse seem structurally designed to have Europe not actually do more, right? So how do we think about the economic constraints on more, if it's about respect and public investment and, fighting the far right, or if it's on more defense spending? How does that happen in Germany and in Europe, given the institutional constraints that we're facing?
Thank you. There was one more question over here. Yes, back there.
Good evening. I'm Francesco, a European governance student here at Hertie. And my question is on your faith on an effective long-term European foreign policy. Because what Professor Garton previously said is that there is some kind of uneasiness in acknowledging that one point does not lead to the neglection of another one. We can acknowledge two different standpoints without excluding the other. Yet, in my opinion at least, it seems that that is precisely what is happening at European level, where there is some kind of impossibility in saying we acknowledge this, but at the same time we also are aware of this other point of view. And so this, in my opinion, leads also to some kind of idealistic driven foreign policy rather than a proper pragmatic one. And I wanted to ask your point of view on this, and whether do you think is actually true, and whether this can actually prevent a proper European foreign policy that leads to some result.
And someone had their hand up over here. Oh, over here. Sorry. Over here, the gentleman. Yes.
Wolfgang Rudolschauser. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy in Hamburg. We mentioned Trump. You mentioned Europe should do more. I haven't heard anything about this, what I call a ghost debate about European nuclear weapons. What's your take on this? Thank you.
Well, it is just that.
Who would like to go first?
Why don't I do the nuclear deterrent and leave the rest to you? Because you know what, it is exactly that. It's a ghost debate. It's interesting in that it's politically symptomatic, right? I have a sort of collection of files. This used to be what the Germans called I have to translate for the non-Germans here, a saure Gurkenthema, right? Something that, you know, newspapers would cover in the summer when everything else had been covered, right? Then somebody would write an article about the German bomb or the European bomb. What I find interesting is that the topic itself has developed so much more traction than before, notably because we're not in August, right? And psychologically, I think that's interesting, right? In terms of policy, all you need to do is to listen to or read the real experts, of which I am not one, who will tell you that, you know, this is... I think the too long don't read version is forget about it. What's problematic about this debate is that it is, of course, also what psychologists call an Ersatzhandlung, right? Which is, it is an ersatz thing to do instead of the thing you're procrastinating. Instead of doing the thing that is really important, which is focusing very firmly and with great urgency on improving your conventional resilience, deterrence, and defense, you're talking about something that is fundamentally at this point completely unrealistic. And that I do worry about, because Ersatzhandlung and politics are usually indicative of a moment of danger. That's where we, I think, need to be focused very firmly. I think that the shoes are dropping across European capitals, including in this one. But are we behind the curve with it? Yes. Anyway, sorry, that was supposed to be a short answer. It wasn't. Over to you.
On the economy, absolutely. Both the debt brake and the new version of the SGP are clearly constraining German adaptation and European economic growth. And it's an instance of the way in which the German system, which was designed to have many checks and balances, is now becoming the victim of its own checks and balances. So the secret of the Federal Republic for many years was change through consensus. And now you're having neither change nor consensus, right? And you're having a fragmentation of the party system. The Constitutional Court is very outspoken on issues like this. And there are all these different checks and balances which are preventing radical change, so that I think it's a systemic problem of the German system. And I don't have an easy answer to it. On European foreign policy, if I could just quickly take that one, I think it's anything but starry-eyed, you know, federalist idealism. I think it's a very realistic view of the world we're in, which we've both been trying to describe, which is as the US becomes less relatively willing to support and sustain Europe, and given China and India and Turkey and Russia and South Africa and Brazil, all these other great and middle powers, our ability to defend our own interests and values has diminished, is diminishing, and will continue to diminish unless we get our act together. It's as simple as that. It's a hard reality. And what I think we have achieved, and I mentioned the European Council on Foreign Relations, that's something we've been working on for many, many years, is a kind of shared strategic culture. That's to say, unlike 20 years ago, the kind of conversation we've been having today is a conversation you'd have in Paris or in Rome or in London or Warsaw. Many of the same issues, many of the same points would be made, many of the same appeals would be made. The problem is it's not translating into policies sufficiently, because while our policy level may be European, our politics are still national. And our leaders are always reacting to the threat of the next election or the latest opinion poll. So that is, that's the big challenge. But I have absolutely no doubt that unless we do more to defend ourselves, to get a more coherent European foreign and security policy, other people will be eating our lunch in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time. And so it's up to you guys, particularly the students in the room, to keep banging that drum and demanding it of our leaders. Over to you.
Can I make 2 final points here? One on the European nuclear debate here in Germany. I mean, it is more than ironic, right? So this is a country that has just shut down all its civilian nuclear plants, and that is suddenly talking about a nuclear deterrent. Give me a break, right? My somewhat more serious point is that I have been watching the demonstrations in Germany against the AfD with a great deal of emotion, right, and sympathy, especially because of their breadth, their demographic diversity, and the fact that they're taking place all over the East in small countries, where you are possibly standing in front of a thug, right, whose mother you went to school with, right? I mean, this is really quite remarkable. But it seems to me that in these demonstrations, there is also a mandate for German politicians to be more courageous. And that, I think, is really quite something. We haven't seen demonstrations of this size, right, since the fall of the wall, and then they were on the other side of the wall, right? We haven't much been given to sort of march around and say, this will not stand, right? I find that truly moving. And again, but it can't end there. And I do hope, I have actually a lot of sympathy for people sitting in ministries late at night, right? Secretaries have all gone home, and they're sitting on the top floor and thinking, holy fuck, what are we going to do now? And I think this would be something to take encouragement from and think, okay, these are our citizens talking to us. We can do this.
But I think you still need to win back their voters at the end of the day, if you don't want people to vote for fascists, it's a good idea to start by not calling their voters fascists, right? The leaders may be fascists, but the voters aren't. So that I think there's a real lesson there. But let me finish, because we've been rather gloomy in saying that it is entirely possible that both Germany and Europe will address these problems. One or two of you in this room may be old enough to remember the 1970s. In the 1970s, the West was going completely to pot. The US was out after Watergate in Vietnam. New York was bankrupt. Britain was the sick man of Europe. France and Germany had finished the Trente Glorieuses. Eastern Europe looked as if it was going to be Soviet-ruled for the next 50 years. I mean, there was massive pessimism. And because people had that crucial combination, which is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, that is to say, you understand how deep the problems are, but you have the guts and the will and the determination to take them on. Because people found quite radical solutions in the 1980s, it actually started one of the most hopeful and optimistic periods in the history of Europe. So we did it once and we can do it again.
On that extremely positive note, on that very hopeful note, I want to thank you, Timothy, and you, Constanze, for a really, really engaging, stimulating, thought-provoking discussion. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for your great questions. I hope to see you again at an event soon at Hertie. And with that, good night and all the best.